لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. Today for our Coffee and Connection session, we have a special guest with us from South Jersey, Ustadh Yusuf Weltch. And Ustadh Yusuf studied at an Islamic studies program in the United States and completed 4 years of studies there, and then he traveled to Tarim and studied at the Mustafa with Habib Umar bin Hafil and other distinguished scholars for 3.5 years, and then returned back to the US, and he's presently there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and we've been looking at some of the teachings of one of the great luminaries of our time, Habib Umar bin Hafiz. Ustadh Amjad covered Habib Umar's work on prophetic character previously, and now the work that he's teaching from, Ustadh Amjad's teaching from, the Mamlakatul Qalbi wal A'da, I don't know how, Ustadh Amjad likes using fancy words that are really hip to, like what, the kingdom of the heart and the limbs, or something like that. So Ustadh Amjad's in Spain right now, and he's not vacationing, he's teaching. So there's a Spanish connection because Ustadh Yusuf is of Puerto Rican background, right? Costa Rican background. So there's a Hispanic undertone. I grew up in Spain. So there's like the Spanish-speaking angels have conspired. Alhamdulillah. So Ustadh Yusuf will be sharing a counsel on Ramadan from one of the great imams of the last 3 centuries, Imam Abdullah bin Ali al-Haddad, from his work Counsels of Religion, and then we'll have our opportunity for discussion and questions after that. So let's give our attention to Ustadh Yusuf. If you just begin, Sayyidi, with just telling us a little bit about the author and his significance, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulil kareem. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala sayyidina Muhammad habibika al-muhibbi wa muhibbika kama yurdika wa yurdihi habibana ilayhi wa zidna mahabbatan fihi. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The author of this book, obviously his biography or any synopsis of his life could not be explained in a few minutes. But inshallah, just by mentioning the names of these people, inshallah, the blessing of the connection to them will be, inshallah, acquired. Imam Abdullah bin Ali al-Haddad, he was one of the great Shafi'i scholars of the southern region of Yemen in a place called Hadramaut. Ever since he was a very young child, his parents saw in him something that was very unique from the other children. And there's one story where his parents had ordered him to go out and play with the other kids. And he did so, being obedient to his parents' command. And he went to play with the kids, but then shortly after that, they saw that he kind of sat to the side and he started to remember Allah with his subha. He started to make dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the parents, after intuiting that there was something different about this child, what happened was the father of Imam Haddad set him up with some classes in the local masjid with one of the shuyukh of his time. And it was from a very young age that he would frequent the class after Fajr, and then after that he would pray 200 rakats of Ishraq, 200 rakat nafil every single day from childhood. So this was the beginning of Imam Haddad. So we know that from there there's only improvement. There's only increase in his worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shortly thereafter, he got very sick and he lost his eyesight. So he continued his studies, he continued the memorizing of the Quran and the memorizing of many religious books, even though he had lost his eyesight. And he was considered to be, later on in his life, Qutb al-Da'wah wal-Irshad. He is the pillar of da'wah, of calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and guiding people. So this Imam, he was considered a scholar in the outward sciences. He was one of the great Shafi'i scholars, and some even considered him to be one of the highest levels of a scholar could reach in fiqh. He was a great scholar in regards to poetry. He was one of the most eloquent of his time in poetry, and many of his poems are still read today. قَدْ كَفَانِي عِلْمُ رَبِّي مِنْ سُؤَالِي وَاخْتِيَارِي أَلَا يَا اللَّهُ بِنَظْرَةٍ. They're quite famous in these times. They have been translated as well. And he has authored many books in regards to explaining the way of the deen in the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in such a way that anybody could read it. And the clarity by which he writes was something that was very well known about the Imam, which was similar to, which his style was similar to the style of Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, where he would give very clear examples of what he means and to make things clear for the people to understand. And his book can be read on many different levels. So you can just quickly read through his books because it's so easy to read, but you could also take each line one after another and spend days on them. And it was our beloved teacher, Sayyid Habib Umar, he advised us to read one of his books, Adab al-Suluk Murid, which is the etiquettes of the seeker. And then Sayyid Habib, he said that when you read this book, read one chapter at a time, and do not move to the second chapter until you completely practice the first chapter. Right? So the book could be read in maybe 20 minutes. It's a very small book, but in order to practice the book, it takes a lot of dedication because of the profound meaning within it. And Imam Haddad, he mentioned that he put his secrets, if you want to metaphorically, in three things. One would be his his students, with the likes of Imam Abdul Rahman bin Abdullah al-Balfiqi, Allamat al-Dunya. And he put the second would be in his poetry, and then the third would be in his books. So we have a small synopsis of a book here, one of the many books of Imam Haddad, called An-Nasaih Ad-Diniyah, Religious Counsels, or the Counsels of Religion is translated here. And with permission, inshallah, just because Ramadan is coming and it's at our door, in order to prepare ourselves mentally and spiritually to be able to benefit from Ramadan, I feel it's important to truly to go through what Imam Haddad has to say about Ramadan. So just a small synopsis of what he mentions here about the virtues of Ramadan. It should be good with all of them. What would you say? Maybe I can summarize it because it's a bit long. So Imam Haddad first, he connects the inward spirit of the act of worship to its outward form. So every single act of worship has an outward form, and majority of that would be learned in a class of fiqh. So for instance, the prayer has an outward form, a way that you stand, the proper way to make ruku', the proper way to make the sajda. But there is also an inward reality to each and every act of worship, which must be also coupled in order for that act of worship to have its full benefit on the heart and to unlock the realities of the heart. So fasting, obviously the outward form would be to withhold from eating, drinking, or any marital relations from Fajr till Maghrib. And that would be with an intention. And that would be considered, in regards to fiqh, valid. But in order for the fast to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order for it to unlock what it's supposed to unlock of the heart, in order for the benefit to be obtained from that fasting, then there has to be some inward realities also coupling the outward form. So amongst them is that The blessing of fasting, one of the wisdoms behind it is that, in order to understand this, let's quickly go through that human beings, we have a double nature. We have this physical body that we are in, but we are also our spiritual side. So the spiritual side of which is the purpose, which is our main essence, is that we were once souls, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to us, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And the souls replied, yes, we bear witness to that. But then after that, we were put into this body, and the body has needs. The body needs to eat, it needs to drink, it needs certain things to carry on and to live in order to be able to fulfill this purpose. But if a person goes in excess in giving priority to the body over the soul, what happens is that the soul becomes very kathif. It becomes almost like a veil the body becomes almost like a veil to the soul, and then the soul is almost entrapped inside this physical form. So one of the blessings of fasting is that it almost forces us to neglect the body for a moment, voluntarily to neglect the body for a moment, thus automatically giving priority to the soul. Right? And Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, he mentions that that the source of all of the diseases of the heart is overeating. He mentions that is where everything starts. That's where everything starts to go wrong. Is that when a person gives too much preference to the body, it gives it more than what it needs. It oversatiates the body. Too much speaking, too much eating, too much sleeping, more than the necessity. The body becomes strong and the soul becomes weak. So, and the opposite is also true, that if a person were to give the body only what it needs, enough food, as the Prophet ﷺ said, يَكْفِينَ إِبْنَ آدَمْ لُقِيمَاتِ يُقِمْنَ صُلْبَهُ, that for the child of Adam, it is sufficient to have a few morsels that will keep his back straight. The second part is what we know to be the most famous of the sunnah, that and if he has to, then 1/3 for his food, 1/3 for his drink, and 1/3 for his air, which is actually the concession. It's a permission to go further, but not actually the reality, the true sunnah. So if a person were to just give the body only what it needs, a certain amount of sleep, a certain amount of drink, a certain amount of food, a certain amount of mixing with people, and then for the rest of the time to devote that to the strengthening of the soul, then they would find a much different reality in their relationship with their faith and with their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whether a person does that voluntarily or not, they have to do it in some bit in Ramadan. So in Ramadan, there's a limiting of food, there's a limiting of drink, there's a limiting of the other desires of the body, which is why in order to preserve the reality of fasting, it is discouraged to sleep a lot, to sleep, even though even though the sleeping of the fasting person is an act of worship, but to excessively sleep over necessity is a waste of time. To excessively eat during iftar defeats the purpose. And then during the days of fasting, since the shaitan, because the nafs is very weakened, he can't get you through that aspect, so he'll get you through another aspect, which is excessive speaking, backbiting, lying, which would take away from the reward of that. And as the hadith goes, كَمْ مَنْ صَائِمًا لَيْسَ لَهُ مِنْ صِيَامِهِ إِلَّا الْجُوعُ وَالْعَطَشِ. How many people fast and they only receive, and the only thing that they get from their fasting is hunger and thirst. So this is why that Imam al-Ghazali and Imam Haddad, he also mentions here that there are 3 levels to the fasting. At the first level is the basic shara'i, the fiqh level, which is to abstain from food, drink, and relations from Fajr to Maghrib. That's the first level, and that is the obligatory level for everybody. That if they weren't to do that, then they would not have fulfilled their obligation. But if a person does that, the second level, which is the level that we should all try to aspire to attain, and then the third level thereafter, the second level is somun jawarih anil ma'asi, that a person abstains that all of their limbs and their entire being from all sins. right? So a person could go through the whole day not eating anything, but he's backbiting all day long, then that's not going to benefit his heart. Whereas the second level of fasting is to stay away from that. No lying, no backbiting, no excessive speech which will not benefit you in this world or the next, and actually may even destroy the reward of the fast, to watch the gaze, to not look at that which is haram, to try to not waste time, to spend more time in building a relationship with the Quran, which will hopefully last until the next Ramadan, and to build a relationship with dua to Allah and making voluntary prayers. And then the highest level of fasting, which is the fasting of the elites, the fasting of the prophets, the fasting of the awliya, which is to withhold the heart from being distracted by anything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That the heart is 100% devoted into presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to always being present, not heedless of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the fasting of the elite. And it was said about the Prophet ﷺ, that he used to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every one of its moments, at every moment. And that nothing would ever distract him from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even though he had outward responsibilities, he would speak to people, he would answer their questions, he would guide them, but at all times his heart was present with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the highest level of fasting. And Imam al-Muhasibi, he mentions in his book about this presence of heart, which is one of the source fundamental principles for every act of worship. That Allah says, وَأَقِيمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِ, and establish prayer for my remembrance. So every single act of worship, if it's done with the outward and the inward parts together, then it will cause the heart to be present with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Imam Muhasibi says, in regards to this presence of heart, he said that the first level is at the tayaqqud, is to first wake up, to no longer be heedless, to no longer be somnambulant, you can say, or sleeping, spiritually sleeping. But the highest level is to forget. So how is that? Meaning that the first level is to push yourself and almost force yourself to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to always be in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the highest level is that once this remembrance overpowers the heart, that is to forget, meaning that everything besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgotten. Meaning the same amount of effort that it took you in the beginning to remember Allah, it would take that much effort to forget about Allah, to remember other than Allah. Meaning that we deal with we have our lives, we have our work, we have our families, but we do it for the sake of Allah. Everything is for Allah. Everything has that connection back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Does not mean that we're completely secluded or that we're just remembering Allah only and neglecting our responsibilities. But it's a state of the heart, whereas the limbs can do whatever. Right? They have a saying in Tarim that al-yad al-shaghala wal-qalb al-shaghal, that the hands are working, but the heart is also working. That the heart is devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and everything that the limbs are doing is in support of that devotion. That they're doing it because of that devotion. They're doing it in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. So he mentions a few ahadith in here, and there are quite many ahadith on the virtues of Ramadan, and I'm sure you will all hear them in these next couple of weeks. But there is one specific thing that I wanted to mention before I hand over metaphorically the mic to Sheikh Faraz, is that the first night of Ramadan, and the first night of Ramadan, which some scholars have named as Laylat al-Nadra, as the night of the gaze, of the glance, where as it comes in a narration that إِذَا كَانَتِ اللَّيْلَةُ الْأُولَى مِنْ رَمَضَانَ, that when it's the first night of Ramadan, the first night of Ramadan, meaning there's no fasting, it is the first Taraweeh. So then when they announce that tomorrow we will fast, that is the first night of Ramadan. And the Prophet, and the hadith goes that when it is the first night of Ramadan, that Allah gazes at His servants. He gave a glance to His servants, a glance of mercy, a glance of tawfiq. And whoever Allah glances at, or whoever Allah gazes upon, then He will never punish him ever. So in preparation of Ramadan, I would say that the biggest preparation should be made for the first night of Ramadan. And everything after that would just be a bonus. Because if a person if Allah gazes at His servant in that night, in the first of the night of Ramadan, which many people are heedless of, because the next day they know they have to fast, so they kind of overdo it the night before, knowing that, oh, tomorrow I'm not going to be able to have good food during the day, so let me have an extra meal there. What miskin, the human beings were. So this first night, that if Allah gazes to His servants and He sees them in tawajjuh, in dedication to Him, in focus of Him, and turning their hearts toward Him, trying to build a relationship with the Quran, trying to pray their salats in the congregation, trying to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that night, and Allah gazes at them, then they have obtained the stamp of approval, which will save them in the next life and this life, that Allah will never punish them. And if whoever attains that, then they don't have anything else to worry about. If whoever attains that, then they have attained one of the greatest things they could ever attain. So it is that first night. And then obviously there are other nights that are very blessed in the night of Ramadan, in the nights of Ramadan, which is Laylatul Qadr as well as the last night of Ramadan, which is called Laylatul Maghfirah, the night of forgiveness. So the Prophet ﷺ said that on the last night of Ramadan, Allah will forgive all of His servants. And the Sahaba, they said, Ahiya Laylatul Qadr, Ya Rasulullah, is that Laylatul Qadr, O Messenger of Allah? He said, no, but workers are only given their full salary when their work is finished. So that is the last night of Ramadan, and then thereafter is the night of Eid, the day of Eid. So this is just a small drop from the ocean of what Imam Haddad has to offer in his books, and I'm sure I heard just now that they'll be covering the Book of Assistance during Ramadan. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to benefit from this blessed month, and not to allow it to escape our hands without having been forgiven through this month, and reuniting our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our connection with Quran, our connection with Salah, in a way that is pleasing to Allah and His Messenger, in a way that will last until the next Ramadan, with istiqamah, inshallah. Alhamdulillah.